Hello and welcome to Adventures in AI, where the Insight Flow team members share things that have caught our attention over the past week and talk about our own experiences in the world of AI. If you want to get in touch with us about this or any other podcast, please email aiai@insightflow.io or find us on LinkedIn at insightflow-io or Twitter on @insightflow1. I'm Giles.
I'm Rich.
And I'm Graham.
So today we'd like to talk a little bit about knowledge graphs and retrieval augmented generation. So this is off the back of some research that Microsoft Research have been doing to look at how using knowledge graphs can improve the responses that you get from AI quite considerably. Now, I think it's worth just saying what we're trying to do in this podcast is really get this into a business context so you can understand what it would mean for an organization if you're thinking about using private information within your business and trying to get AIs to give decent answers around that private information. And so this topic actually really helps to explain that. So I'm just going to talk quickly through what Microsoft Research were looking at, why they were looking at it, and what they found, first of all. And then we can talk a little bit more about why this approach is different to what's been before, what it means for businesses and how it compares to what's currently being done. So essentially what Microsoft Research did was they said, okay, well, if you've got a private data set, so, the usual example would be inside an organization, you have information that is confidential, you don't want to share outside the organization. You want to use that information to help a model answer some questions or to process information or whatever it happens to be. And the problem is that most of the techniques at the moment don't actually give the model enough context to be able to answer some of the kind of questions that you would have. So the way they describe it is the baseline retrieval augmented generation struggles to connect the dots between things that are going on in an organization. And if you think about what exactly is going on, if let's say in the real world, I go and ask somebody to write me a report about something. If I don't give them enough context when I'm asking them to write that report, then they're going to really struggle to do it. And they'll either ask me if they're not scared of me, or they'll go and ask someone else, or they'll beaver off and kind of try and connect the dots themselves by doing a load of research. And I would say the same is very much true of an AI. You could design an AI so that it goes off and runs a load of searches and tries to find information within your private data store to get the answers that that you're asking for. That can be quite expensive and complex. And so essentially what Microsoft Research were doing is saying that when we index the information and kind of pull it into our data store, what we're going to do is we're going to identify the bits of knowledge that are relevant and add those specifically into the knowledge base so that, for example, project has a name, has a description, we understand what it is, or client, ABC, we know what they are, who they are, what they're all about. And so whenever we ask the model a question about client ABC, we can feed that information into the model as well as the other stuff that we're asking about. So with our prompt and everything else. And that's then giving it some really solid factual, if you like, information about things that are important to us in our organization. The other thing that's worth saying, that's kind of an alternative to some of the techniques around summarization, which we've talked about previously, where if you're trying to summarize large documents, then actually it becomes quite difficult to know what's important. And this is a very different technique, because essentially what you're saying is, what are the things that I'm interested in? What are the things that I need to know about in order to help with the kinds of questions that people are going to answer? And so, you can think of this very much as being right in the front and center of what's required for knowledge building. knowledge base building, I should say. So that's the context of what they're trying to do. And I don't know what you guys thought about the research.
Yeah, and I think just to help explain this to people, and this is how I've kind of taught myself in my own head as I'm kind of understanding the concept. So I think if you think of the traditional retrieval augmented generation, how it's happening as, so you've got a bunch of economics essays and you want to find information out about inflation. So you do a kind of analogous to what is happening within vector embedding. So it's kind of the control F is actually looking for similarities based on vector embeddings. What's happening with a knowledge graph? It's this layer on top. So you've still got all of your economics essays, but there's a pre-processing stage where on top of that, say you've built a study guide. So it's got kind of contents, glossary, chapters, and all that. So this time, instead of you just doing that Control F, your first port of call would be go to the glossary of the study guide, look for inflation, see what pages that's on. There'd be a summary of what inflation is at the start of the inflation chapter, and then it would have references to the essays. And if you wanted to go a step further in terms of actually what's happening is, instead of a study guide, think of a mind map if you've used mind maps before. Graham, you use mind maps a lot. I think within the first hour of the first project we ever worked on, you had a mind map, and that's because they're incredibly useful for being able to conceptualize and connect information together.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of building context and setting a common language should be core to any kind of business briefing. I mean, I think that one is fairly self-evident. I think the idea of and the reason I love mind maps is that it builds the relationships. It starts in a relatively simplistic way to show what is important and what is linked and how the hierarchies work. And in fact, in deciding the hierarchies of the potential information or the potential scope of the report that you're writing, as an example, it feels to me to be an incredibly useful thing that everybody can refer to. So, bringing it back to the conversation that we've got here and that, Giles, you're talking about, this idea that says that we are, as is so often the case, actually treating AIs in the same way that we would treat humans, which is give them a good context, give them a good briefing, show them the hierarchy of thinking and show them what's linked and what's related to each other, feels to be fairly self-evidently useful.
I think the most interesting thing is that Rich is talking about traditional RAG, given that traditional RAG has only been around for about a year. So, yeah. which I think gives you some indication of how fast things are moving. I think what's interesting, if you think about what RAG is effectively and has always been, traditional RAG in particular, obviously, but it's always been about giving context. And the difficulty and the things that I suppose the evolution of the field, if you like, is essentially how do we give better context? And this feels to me like a really significant leap forward in giving better context, but it's one that comes with a whole load of challenges of its own, because actually, Google has spent years and years building a knowledge graph for the public web, they know, or their knowledge graph knows who Joe Biden is. It knows all about all the different football teams. So it has a whole load of information that it can say. It can throw up a panel on the right-hand side or wherever it is these days. I can't seem to move around. And, say, I know about this particular thing, and this is what I know about it. And it's usually from Wikipedia, by the way. But having the equivalent of that inside an organization, actually there's very few organizations that have invested heavily in knowledge management to the point of that they have that kind of knowledge graph set up in the organization. And so for every other organization, you have a real challenge that says, okay, well, where do I start? How do I actually start building this knowledge graph? So I think that's an important thing to consider. It's probably worth just trying to highlight a little bit more about why this is different and where it applies as well. So I think when we're thinking about interacting with ChatGPT, for example, if you give it a request, you have to include all of the context for that request within the thing that you type in. And it often feels like you're typing the same thing over and over again because it's always forgotten from the previous chat. If what you're trying to get it to do does rely heavily on private information, so whether that's in a business context, information about your customers, information about your products, information about your projects that you've got going on, information about your staff, policies, whatever it happens to be, that requires you to go off, pull stuff into ChatGPT, put it in the context, ahead of or as part of the prompt that you're writing. And then you'll get a response, and then you realize it's not quite right, so you have to do it again. So it can be quite a painful process. And the default, if you don't do that, is that the AI relies on what it already knows. And what it already knows was trained on public data, quite often 6 to 12 months out of date. And so it's not, it's not going to give you particularly helpful results. So traditional RAG, as I said, does provide some help for that, but it's based just on doing a search, essentially. And using a knowledge graph actually says, okay, well, if I understand that a particular name has this profile, then I can really start to provide accurate information back. And so that's really the difference between the two.
It might be useful at this stage just to give a sort of pen portrait of what you're talking about when you say knowledge graph, and what are you meaning by knowledge graph?
Yeah, so if you take a really simple example of a Slack message or a tweet. So if I mention somebody or if I do a hashtag, then both of those two things are actually creating a link, if you like. So the mention is creating a link to a person's profile. The hashtag is creating a link to all of the tweets or messages that have that hashtag. And so they're both, I suppose, connections in the graph, if you like. So all the graph is it's links between things and understanding what those links are. But if you think of specifically the mention example, that would take me to the person's profile typically, where there will be however much information they've chosen to feed in about their profile. So if you take that example, if I just put the text of that message into the prompt, so it would just say Graham, at Graham, that's all the model would know. Whereas if I go, okay, here's some context. This is who Graham is. This is, the message that he sent, and here's the question I have. You can immediately see, if that were a human and you gave them, okay, here's Graham and his profile, and here's the message that he sent, and this is what I want you to, I want you to reply to it, for example. Then you can immediately see how actually, if we don't do that, the model's going to struggle in the same way that a human would struggle.
And just to help people visualize this, which is always going to be hard on a podcast, but it's one that's really useful when you do see it. It's if you think of the graph literally as a plot graph, and there's clusters around, let's say, objects and topics and things that are clustered like with bubbles. And so if say Graham's on the chart and there's lots of information about Graham, then there'd be a really big clustering around Graham. And say if there were other topics, like I don't know, there's bananas, there's a clustering around bananas, and if Graham tweeted about bananas, then that would be the relationship between those two objects.
This is the Graham's banana import business that we're talking about, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Well, rather that than accuse me of being bananas, which I suspected that topic might be heading towards.
See, there's a really heavy cluster there.
Yeah. What I really like as well, about knowledge graphs is, and this is something that you don't often think about unless you get into the nitty gritty of the kind of designing an AI model. And it's that embeddings are really dependent on the chunk size that you decide to chunk all of your private data up into. And if you think about it, it's a completely arbitrary number. Say, okay, I'm going to chunk all of my information up into 400 word chunks, for example, get an embedding for that. But if I chunked the same data up into 200 word chunks, they'd have completely different embeddings because you're potentially mixing topics or taking topics away. So that's actually like a real challenge for people trying to build models. It's actually what chunk size is optimal for what I'm trying to do, and like, will that stay optimal over time? It's something you have to monitor. But with this kind of knowledge graph, which I almost see it's like an abstraction layer to the information, you start to take that chunk size out of the equation, because first it's going to the knowledge graph, and I think our human brains work in a similar way, in that there's an abstraction layer between the thought and the language, and I think it's kind of starting to replicate that a little bit. Like, if you want to say you're hungry, you don't have the sentence in your head. You think the thought first, and there's an abstraction layer to get to you saying that. Obviously, bananas have just made me hungry.
Well, I think the other interesting point there, if you think about a sentence that you might say within an organization, so something along the lines of, I've got my Monday routine. Now, if you were just interpreting that directly based on the English language, then you might think, okay, my Monday routine, I don't know what the routine is. Is it like, gets up at 6 o'clock in the morning and goes for a run, and then, or is it actually a regular meeting that you have every Monday? And depending on the culture within the organization, the language that's used within the organization, it might mean either of those two things. So some organizations may not describe it as a routine, being short for routine meeting, for example. So and that's where I could see knowledge graphs being really, really powerful for helping anchor a model in the, I suppose, the culture, language, and I suppose I want to say kind of subjects that an organization is interested in.
But I think there's an additional layer there, which is really interesting in that example. That Monday routine also has implicit weight, in that Monday being, for us at least, the first day of the week, is a sense of the things that happen at the beginning of the week, and all sorts of other things that are carried in it that are almost never made explicit, but are most often fairly true. And the idea that there would be I think, conceptually, a fairly large difference between Monday routine and Friday routine, and that we would all share a common sense of what those two things were and recognise that they were very different. And unless you capture the relationships between those, and the relationships between those and other concepts, Monday, beginning of the week, pile of weekend mail to catch up on, or what have you, or Friday, close down, get ready for the weekend, or whatever else it is. There is nothing that's ever going to make it obvious to people who don't have that cultural context in place.
Yeah, and I think there's a huge challenge actually that organizations then face when they're onboarding new people, because it actually does take people time and effort and patience to understand the language of an organization, the routines of an organization, and all this kind of thing. And actually, that's an area where we've talked about it in the context of HR before. But I think the kind of knowledge base that actually articulates those things much more clearly, and is therefore available to not only the AI model, but also the human searching, becomes really, really powerful. Because if you're trying to get someone up to speed and they're going, routine, what the hell's that? And they look up routine and it goes, oh, okay, yeah, I understand what it is now. And it can help get people up to speed much, much faster. So, I think that's quite an important area.
Yeah, and actually, so that macro contextual view that lets people understand kind of what routine means in that context helps with tons and tons of different kind of business reasons that you might use AI. So I guess one of my hobbies is torturing myself with, I would have used a lot, and you can do with GraphRag because of this contextual understanding. It's if you ask it questions on a database, a knowledge base. For example, what are the top 5 themes in this data? Traditional RAG is not very good at that, and the reason it's not very good is because it's you don't give it a lot of information, so it's almost just searching for where has the word themes, for example, been talked about before in this data, and it tries to bring back information related to that. And you have to be very specific in order to get information. So you'd have to ask things like, what positives did they say in the interviews about customer service? So RAG could do that brilliantly, but the themes it would struggle on. But the graph RAG, because it's got this abstraction layer where it knows where everything's connected together, it can see where the large clusters are. It can say, okay, the top 5 clusters in this data are X, Y, Z, and it can give you that information included in summaries about them as well. And it's worth also pointing out that this is one of the tests that Microsoft did on their data sets, and it performed really, really well on compared to the traditional RAG, because of it going to the clusters first and seeing actually where is information kind of grouped together.
Yeah, and I guess essentially what it's doing there is saying, okay, well, what is this data set about? And it's getting that information from the clusters rather than having to do a search. And I do think that's a great example of where an AI will struggle in exactly the same way a human would, which is like, if I don't know which questions to ask, I can't perform a decent search. So I'm kind of shooting blind at that point. Whereas if someone already knows and can go, okay, well, here are the things you're likely to find in this. And actually, if you kind of follow, if you do the follow the rabbit kind of route through that graph, then you can start to find more and more maybe arcane bits of information and or detailed bits of information. But at least you've got a starting point at that, from that kind of understanding of the clusters and what they're about. So I think,
and I've run into problems before when I've known that there's information in my knowledge base before about a certain topic, and maybe because I've been lazy and I've worded the question, it said, sorry, there isn't any information about it. And it's only because I know the knowledge base very well that I can then reword it. If somebody didn't, they'd just think that the information wasn't there. And that's why I think this new concept of knowledge graphs will help to alleviate those kind of problems.
Yeah, I think one of the other things it does, I suppose conceptually, it's like giving the model the ability to browse rather than search. So, if you think about its ability to go, okay, well, I can follow the graph, and that's my, really what I was talking about when I was talking about the white rabbit and following that down various different tracks. But essentially, that's browsing. Now, obviously, what you have to make sure is the model doesn't get too curious and go, oh, look, there's all this really interesting stuff. I'm just going to, use up all of your tokens trying to browse this because it's great. But it does mean that, that shot in the dark search.
And my understanding as well, maybe correct me if I'm wrong. So the knowledge graph is it's a pre-processing stage that it looks to be kind of automated. So you as a business, what are you doing differently? Nothing if you're just providing your data. It's actually kind of an automated process where a knowledge graph will be built up around your data. And I think my assumption is that actually adding data to that is fine as well, because you just editing the knowledge graph, adding connections or kind of adding clusters as well.
Yes, and I think this is where you see the collision of more traditional systems and an AI really hitting, because if the majority of what we know in an organization is going to be in one of a couple of places. So it'll either be in things like CRM systems, ERP systems, or it'll be in document stores of some sort, or actually increasingly email and Slack, so messaging systems. And so essentially that pre-processing step is saying, right, I've found this phrase in here that looks like, let's say, a person, or looks like a company, or looks like a product or whatever. And then it can run a search and pull the information back to say, okay, yeah, I found it in this data set. and I'm going to enrich, therefore, this piece of information with that link. Now, that may not be the way Microsoft were doing it, by the way, because they didn't explain specifically in the research post that they put out. But assuming it's something like that, then what you have to do as an organization then is connect, or at least have available to the pre-processing step, all of the data in all of the systems that you've got in a way that's easy to search. So it has some fairly significant implications for the organization. So some of those data sets are more easily available than others, but even things like your list of employees. So should you make that available to the model? Should you what implications does that have? I think there's a whole load of data security, privacy, and other kinds of issues that come from that. So then there's some difficult decisions to make about exactly what to, which pools of information to include and which ones not to.
Presumably as well. I was trying to think of examples of why companies might not want data to go on there, and I was just following that lead of, okay, I've got people's names, maybe I've got access to emails, then maybe I know what people think of other people. So yeah, I think the idea of the knowledge graph being this black box that you just throw stuff into and then it figures out itself, it does need some thought by the company about where that information is held and how it's used as well.
Yeah, and I think obviously this is something that's dear to our hearts in the way that we're trying to build spaces within Insightflow. But, because the idea of spaces within Insightflow is that you can define the different types of information you're interested in, which are effectively, parts of, we call them atoms, but they're those bits of knowledge that are useful for you and your organization. And by having that approach that says, okay, well, we can define the things that we're interested in, and therefore by omission, the things that we're not interested in, then that's all you need to do in order to define a knowledge graph. And I think approach to this is actually always going to be difficult because every team has different contexts and different requirements and different needs and different approaches and all this sort of thing. So actually, in a way, it's better to do it at a team level than it is at an organization level, I think.
Just to get a little bit more into the nitty gritty of this, and you're talking about creating the graphs and what have you. Where would you create the graph? What tools will you be using to then make that information accessible and usable to the AIs in Graph Origin? So,
essentially, the graph RAG is the same as normal RAG in that all you're asking the model to do is run it's actually two separate searches. So you're running a search on context and running a search on the specific piece of information that you're asking it to answer about, if you need to. I mean, that may be in the prompt. So essentially, if I search for Graham, I want it to return Graham, the profile of the person first. So it's much more about how you set up and tune search than it is about the actual graph itself. Now, there are other ways of doing it, so that you can use a graph database to return the things that are closest connected in the graph. So that is technically a graph-based way of doing it. But you don't necessarily need to. So effectively, what you can do is say, okay, I've identified within this piece of text a person here, a project here, a company here, and a policy here. And all you're then doing is running a search against each of those and including them in the context, and probably only bringing back one, but maybe not. If you've got person and if you've got 15 Grahams, then you might want to bring all 15 back and let it figure out which one it is, or even ask the question and say, hang on a second, I'm not sure which Graham we're talking about here. Can you tell me? And so then it can actually start to do that kind of thing.
Yeah, and topic extraction, something that's been around for a little while now, and certainly in terms of transcribing. So I've used transcribing for years now, and this idea of you can extract topics around, okay, people, like company names, people, and then if you think about it, if you're actually sending requests to the knowledge base about the pets and about the company name and giving that extra context to the AI, this is how it's like kind of helping to bring it all together. to answer as best as possible.
So it's quite funny because, over the weekend I was spending some time trying to get ChatGPT to do entity extraction, it's called. So, that thing of recognizing that this is a person, this is a place, etc. And I realized, having played around with it for a bit, that although GPT-4 is pretty good at it, it's less accurate and certainly less clear about what it knows and what it doesn't know than the much more basic entity extraction models that have been around for 5-6 years now, or longer actually. But the most recent generation of them is actually still better and way faster. So there's a great example there of just because it's the new tech, it doesn't necessarily mean it's better. So in that particular instance, we may well find that doing the entity extraction is much better off done by a more traditional, shall we say, in the world of AI, which obviously means it's like 3 years old, not 6 months old. So I thought it'd be worth just trying to build out a little bit more on the conversation around, well, what does this actually mean for a business? So how might this technology in particular, but also the things that it enables, change the way a business operates? And so my starter for 10 is that businesses will need to start thinking much more about their corporate brain. So there's a sort of a term in personal productivity actually talking about second brain. So there's platforms like Notion and Obsidian that are used by people as a kind of way of capturing the connections between things that they know about. And that might be, books they've read, it might be things to do with work, it might be tasks, whatever. And those are essentially their personal knowledge base. In order for businesses to really leverage AI, I think what they're going to need to start thinking about is, what does the corporate knowledge base look like in a way that is AI enabled? And as I was saying earlier, I think kind of thinking about that at a team level as much as at an organization level is probably helpful, because it's much more tractable, and certainly when you're starting out thinking about this at a team level. So if you take a specific example, if you think about what we were talking about in the last podcast, the marketing team, or even like the content team within the marketing department, what are the things they need to know? What, if they have some particular themes, for example, you might want to start organizing a knowledge graph that covers those themes, holds all of the grounding information about how you think about and write about those themes. It might have things like, strap lines and other things that are commonly used in that knowledge graph. And those all become things that then help an AI to write stuff, but they would also help a human to write stuff, because, you could actually start almost giving them editor assistance in writing stuff when it's a human doing it, using AI. So I think the thing that people in the knowledge management industry have been banging on about for probably 30 years about, you have to organize your company's information. And in my experience, the vast majority of corporates have been going, can we buy some new technology to do all of this for us, please? And the answer's always been yes, of course, because there's always someone who's going to sell it to them, and then it never really works. And so the cycle continues, right? I think this gives a really great opportunity to look at knowledge building and what you might call the corporate memory banks, if you like, of taking those beyond what's in the ERP system and what's in the sales CRM system and all of those kind of big expensive systems that they put in, and moving it into the much more specific stuff that people need to know to get their job done. So I think there's a huge opportunity here. I think there's also a massive challenge for organizations, because it does require a very different way of approaching things. But I think, the payoff is huge, because you can then start to, AI can do a lot more of the heavy lifting for you.
Yeah, I think for a lot of companies, knowledge management, just thinking about it is kind of overwhelming. And so I do think this idea of this automated or heavily automated process that can help to start to do that for them, I think will be massively appealing.
Yeah, I mean, the expense of knowledge management systems has always been, how do I create the connections between things? Because in very, very simple terms, a knowledge graph is literally just this thing is connected to that in some way. And it obviously helps if you know in what way. And so they've been trying to build these kind of relationships by analyzing the information and doing all sorts of other stuff. And actually, if you can do that through a combination of the way that humans use it, and also an AI model going, okay, this looks like one of these kind of things, then you can dramatically sort of simplify that process.
One of the traditional failings of knowledge management platforms is that once they're set up, people are, for all sorts of very good human reasons, reluctant to put information into them. Normally because the overhead of putting information into them is not repaid in the benefits of the knowledge management system. I'm assuming that we can talk about not only greater proficiency in understanding relationships and producing insight out of those relationships or out of that context, but I'm presuming that we can actually deploy AIs to help us do that effectively data input part of it, that traditional knowledge management, and by which I mean traditional knowledge management that's 30 years rather than 30 months old, will help us.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And so I think if you look at how that would be done traditionally, if you look at something, let's take the example of the Graham user profile again, you can start to design and define AIs that can go off to the relevant system, pull all the information in, write a summary about it, and include that as a sort of summary of who is Graham. In an AI-only world, the real Graham wouldn't be able to edit Graham's profile, but in a mixed sort of humans and AI world, which is, what we believe is the right way to go, then you would be able to go and edit that and go, no, it's got me completely wrong. It's, I'm not like that at all. And similarly, if you're thinking about customer information or a customer profile, for example, then having the ability to go and source information from systems, potentially both internally and externally, and getting the AI to do all that research for you to produce a summary, which you might then, in the call center example, that might be what gets popped up to the call center assistant to help them interact with a particular customer. So all of that information, which currently is the bane of, whether it's sales teams or customer teams, the more of that work that can be done for them, the richer the information that they will have about their customers, and the better they can serve them. And if that information is then all available to the AI as well, then it means that the chances of an AI being able to serve those customers as well as the human could is, increases. So I suppose the long and short of it is what might sound like a relatively dry topic around knowledge graphs and RAG, actually, when you think about the business implications of it and you think about what really happens in organizations already, all it's really saying is just give the model a bit of context and it will give you a better response. So that's it for this time. I've been Giles.
I've been Graham.
And I've been Rich.